Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight to the 26th Annual Silha Lecture. My name is Jane Kirtley, and I'm the Silha Professor of Media Ethics and Law here at the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. We're really delighted to see so many of you here tonight. And before I introduce tonight's lecturer, I want to pause for just a moment to pay tribute to the people who made tonight's lecture possible. That is the late Otto Silha and his wife, Helen. Helen is here with us tonight, as well as some of the Silha children and grandchildren, and I hope you'll join me in expressing our thanks to them for making this evening possible. Without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker, because I know you're eager to hear from him. Mark Stevens is an attorney. He is listed in the British edition of Who's Who as a lawyer, a broadcaster, a writer, and a lecturer. He's also been described by the Law Society Gazette as the patron solicitor of previously lost causes. It is his reputation for creativity with the law that leads clients to his door. And I must tell you that his roster of clients is truly amazing, because he works in international comparative media law and regulation, the creative arts, the cultural industries, human rights, judicial review, commercial and intellectual property litigation, as well as many appeals in the ultimate courts in the former British Commonwealth. He's practiced before every level of court in England and Wales, and also represents a number of U.S. media interests in countries around the world. He's also been retained by several governments to advise and to represent their interests, including Cyprus, Jamaica, and the Russian Republic. He's litigated in many countries around the world, including here in the United States, and chairs many bodies, including the Contemporary Art Society and the University of East London. And in fact, he spoke to members of our Board of Regents at the University of Minnesota earlier today to share some views. Just yesterday, it was announced that he is going to be appointed as the new chairman of the board of directors at the Design and Artists Copyright Society. So Mark's interests are wide-ranging, and I think you'll find him a fascinating person to hear from. He is really an impressive individual. He regularly appears in print and on radio and television, and particularly if you ever watch BBC America, you've probably seen Mark opining on many important issues. For those of you who are old enough to remember the British comedy show Spitting Image, Mark was actually a spitting image puppet during the 1990s. He describes his hobbies as bees, badinage, and dandyism. Please join me in welcoming Mark Stevens.
Okay.
We're having a little different format for the Silha lecture tonight than is our usual practice. I think once upon a time, many years ago, there was a Silha lecture that was conducted as a conversation. But Mark actually requested, and I readily agreed, that we might have a lot more fun, and you might have a lot more fun, if we had what Mark calls an observed conversation between the two of us. Because one of the things we've discovered in the many years that we've known each other is that in many respects our careers have gone on parallel tracks. Mark has done a lot of work internationally over the years. I've been doing work internationally too, and we found, for example, that I just got back from Rwanda. He's done work in Rwanda. I'm going to Malaysia next week. He's handling 8 cases in Malaysia. So we thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about some of these things. But I know that what most of you are really here to hear about is one of Mark's most notorious former clients, Julian Assange. So we're going to be talking about Julian Assange. We're going to be talking about Wikileaks and the implications that that has for freedom of information and freedom of expression. Another topic that I think many of you will be interested in is the phone hacking scandal in Great Britain, and what Mark's observations and expectations are about whether that may, in fact, have implications for us here in the United States. Mark himself was a victim of the phone hacking of some of the News of the World operatives, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about that. We're going to talk also about sort of the shape of freedom of expression around the world and how the digital century is changing how we communicate, how people get news and information, and what implications that may have not only for media law but also for media ethics. And after we've exhausted these topics, we're going to invite you to join the conversation as well. And a little bit later in the evening, what will be happening is that two of our illustrious Silha Center research assistants will have handheld microphones that they will be happy to bring to you to pose your questions. And I don't want to be a buzzkill right here at the outset, but I do just want to say that I'm sure many of you are going to have questions that you would like to ask, and we would just request that you keep them brief and to the point. As tempting as it might be to make a speech tonight, we'd ask you to leave that to Mark. So anyway, to get things started,
Is that what they call Minnesota nice?
Yes. Yes, it is. For a transplant, as close to that as I can manage. Anyway, I thought to kick things off, I would kind of lob in Mark's direction a softball, because I think some of you may be curious that there's a string of letters after Mark's name, CBE. And I thought that perhaps at least some people in our audience might not quite know what CBE means. It's not an academic degree. What is it?
It means that I'm a commander of the British Empire. It's an honor conferred by the Queen. And over here in the colonies, it's perhaps a little embarrassing to be a commander of the British Empire, or perhaps former parts of the British Empire. It's quite interesting, because I think some people will be perhaps a little surprised that someone who can represent Julian Assange and cause governments a little bit of trouble would be also embraced by the establishment in the UK and the Queen to mark me out and confer this peculiar honor on me. Interestingly, I got it in June's birthday honors list. They're given twice a year, once in June, once at New Year. And Professor Arthur Miller, who some of you will know in the audience, the American academic and broadcaster, was given it with exactly the same citation for law and the arts. And so Arthur I had bumped into in Charleston, South Carolina last week, and he's now invited me along to his conferment, which will be in the British Embassy in London later this year.
I think we're all agog, because Mark was asking me beforehand what the equivalent was here in the United States, and I really couldn't think what that would be. I mean, you can think of some sectoral things like Kennedy Center honors, or the Presidential Medal of Freedom or something like that, but we really don't have exactly the same thing. So congratulations, and when do you expect the knighthood?
I'm not sure whether the upgrade is going to come or whether this is just a proving ground. But my wife said, does she have to refer to me as Commander Bond anymore? But we shall see.
So anyway, all the more surprising, at least from an American perspective, I think, that Mark would be honored in this way when he has had such controversial clients. And of course, Julian Assange is the one that we're here mostly to talk about. But could you quickly mention your representation of James Hewitt?
Yeah, I mean, many of you will remember that James Hewitt was the man who was Princess Diana's lover. And I represented him at a time when James was denying that he'd had an affair with the wife of the heir apparent. And I had to explain to him that I was very pleased that he hadn't had the affair, because if he had, it was still a capital offense to interfere with the royal bloodline. At which point his Adam's apple wobbled and he flushed. And like every good lawyer, I took it that that meant that he was definite that he hadn't had any affair with Princess Diana.
But, thinking back to the scandal involving the then Princess of Wales and the Prince of Wales, and the whole issue of tapping into the conversations between Camilla Parker Bowles and the Prince, I think this raises the question of whether this whole concept of phone hacking and journalists listening in on private conversations is really a new phenomenon or not? I mean, it's now in the public eye, but has it been going on a long time?
I think it's been going on an incredibly long time. I mean, it was interesting. I also represented a woman called Linda Joyce, who was Princess Anne's lady's maid. And that's probably the most close person working with a member of the royal family, in the sense that they're with them before they wake up and after they go to bed at night. And Linda was accused wrongly of leaking letters, love letters from Commander Timothy Lawrence, who many of you will now know Princess Anne has married. But at the time, she was married to Mark Phillips, and this was one of the earlier scandals within the royal family that came out. And Linda told me at the time that she was sitting in the middle of her stairs. She lived in a little two-up, two-down house, artisan's dwelling in the countryside in the UK. And she said, I was sitting there because the phone was ringing, there were media at the front door, at the back door, they were looking in the windows, and this was the only place in the house that she couldn't be seen. And she said, as she was sitting there, she heard her phone go, and the answer machine clicked in, because she obviously wasn't answering it, and it was one of those old-fashioned answer machines, and she said she could hear the voices on the other end of the phone, and the guy was pressing tones on a keypad, and he said, no, I can't get it to play back. And that, I think, was a very early form of phone hacking. They were dialing into her voicemail to see what she had on the voicemails. And I think that this has been going on, obviously, from the time we had those kind of voicemails and through to today.
And I think from the American perspective, it seems so hard to understand that this would be such an entrenched part of at least some sectors of British journalism. I mean, the obvious question is, wasn't it illegal for them to do this?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been illegal to do this, and it's been made, if you like, more illegal in recent times, in the sense that we've enacted specific legislation, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, for example, which specifically addresses this kind of issue. And but I think that it had become so normal in some of the tabloid newspapers. And I think you have to understand that, you know, if you think about this country, it's got a strong, vibrant, independent press, but many of the newspapers are virtual monopolies or quasi-duopolies in geographic locations. And so you get much less competition, I think. Whereas the competition in the UK is positively fetid. You know, you've got 7 tabloid newspapers all vying for pretty much the same market. And there's enormous pressure on the editors on circulation, and they push that pressure down to journalists. And they have to come up with a story for the meeting. They have to come up with stories every week. And I was doing some research the other day, because I've got a number of clients that were involved in this phone hacking and the victims of the phone hacking. And I was looking at one particular journalist at the News of the World called Neville Thurlbeck. And he's been reasonably high profile because there were sort of emails, the For Neville email. And the thing that's quite interesting about him was that if you look back and search his name, up to 2008, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of stories by him. Post-2008, they drop off a cliff. And the implication that I make from that, and I may be wrong, but I don't think so, is that he was hacking a lot of his stories up until 2008, which is when it stopped in the News of the World, because the News of the World in 2008 put out this One Bad Apple story that the royal correspondent of the News of the World, was the one bad apple in the newspaper that was hacking phones. We all know that that was patently ridiculous and untrue, but they actually stopped hacking at the News of the World in 2008. And I think this altered the behavior of a number of journalists. And so you had a journalist who was employed, who was getting huge numbers of stories, and then suddenly he doesn't get any stories anymore because he hasn't got any developed contacts. The old traditional skills of journalism, he didn't have. He just didn't have any of the information that was necessary. He had to go out and start cultivating sources from scratch.
What would be your expectation about whether any American-based journalists working for the Murdoch empire would be involved in hacking?
I think that's less likely that the US did it. And I think the reason for that is that you had the case here involving Chiquita Bananas and Gannett newspapers when there was a really good story about exploitation of workers by Chiquita Bananas, about the fact that their banana boats were being used to carry drugs into the USA, all sorts of stuff. I mean, really good story. And I think many people think true. But the journalist got that story by hacking into the phones of Chiquita Bananas executives. And what he was doing was he was planting questions into the press office and then listening to the executives fire answers between one another across their voicemails, which I'm sure was all very interesting and extremely revealing. But actually, I think was clearly illegal, and he went to jail, and they settled for $1 million pre-action. I think they got away quite lightly. And I think that pretty much stopped it over here. Whereas the UK, it clearly didn't stop. And I mean, I'm aware, for example, Mia Farrow was hacked over here. I think that Jude Law says that he was hacked while sitting at Kennedy Airport.
But the hacking was presumably done by British journalists?
Yeah, it was. Well, I think by private detectives from the UK dialing into their phones over here. And I think that that is going to open up a whole new can of worms. And it's quite clear, I think, also that the victims or families of the victims of 9/11, many of them really believe that they were hacked at the time. And that, I think, is going to give, if it gets feet and there's evidential proof that could go before a court, then I think that really is going to open this up on this side of the Atlantic. And I think you'll get the same sort of interest that has been generated in the UK. And, of course, you'll know that there's a judicial inquiry as well as parliamentary inquiries. And we've got now 7 police investigations going on into this at the moment.
And that raises 2 questions, at least for me. And one is that I'm not sure everybody in the audience is fully aware of the extent of the involvement of the police in this whole hacking scandal, which I think seems kind of counterintuitive, at least from an American perspective. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite interesting. The police worked very much hand in glove with the newspapers, particularly with News International, the Murdoch papers. And they were paid tip fees, and that's quite routine in the UK. It's illegal, it's corruption of a police officer, but it's also quite usual. And so if a police officer stops someone famous or someone famous comes into a police station, then in those circumstances they're straight on the phone to the News of the World, and they'll get 100, 200 quid by way of a tip fee. That, of course, is illegal. Presumably wasn't paid tax on. More entertainingly, though, it was paid by check, and more recently by bank transfer, electronic transfer. So you couldn't follow the money, and there is an indelible trail there.
Well, I mean, was it just the cost of doing business for the newspapers? I mean,
it was for them, but it wasn't for the officers.
Right.
The problem, of course, is that when the investigation came into the News of the World, the police, some of the officers had risen to the highest ranks and were now deputy chief constables, commanders, and so on and so forth. Not commanders of the British Empire, I should say. They had all had both lavish entertainment, which they hadn't declared, and also had cash earlier in their careers. And that put them in a very compromised position. So they were notionally investigating the news of the world, but they knew that if they did a proper job, they would have to implicate themselves and their brother and sister officers. So that created a huge problem. And so they were quite happy to go along with this one bad apple line. But it became increasingly untenable to run, because it became clear that many people within the newspaper knew what was going on. It became clear that if you went back through the newspaper, you could see from the stories. They had quoted from voicemail messages. They had quoted from SMS messages, text messages. So you know that that had to have come, in most cases, from inappropriate sources. And it was the Director of Public Prosecutions in the UK, sort of, I suppose, an AG equivalent, non-political party, independent prosecutor, who put in a Queen's Counsel, a top barrister in the UK, to go through the police investigation. And it was only at that point they started to take this seriously. And I mean, I, for example, had not been told that I had been hacked. Many of you will know the former Deputy Prime Minister under Tony Blair, Lord Prescott. He was hacked but wasn't told. And it does come to something when people are not told that they're hacked. They're a victim of crime. I had to actually write in and say, have I been hacked? And they came back to, when I asked the question, they were pretty efficient. Within 45 minutes, they came back and said, why do you think you may have been? And I explained that I had a reasonable high profile, and some of my clients did too. And they went away, and within another 45 minutes back, they came back and said, yeah, you've been hacked 3 times. And I went home and told my wife, and she said, well, I hope that that's either a good holiday or at least a new kitchen. We wait and see. Somewhat bated breath. But, some of this behavior was, at that level was you can make light of it, and indeed you have to, because it's happened. But in reality, I think it's really quite worrying that someone feels it's appropriate to hack the phone of a lawyer. People speak to lawyers in a peculiarly candid way, in much the same way as they do to doctors and to priests. And it is clear that they also hacked doctors' phones. So, for example, I have 2 clients, both well-known singers, one of whom was hacked while she was going through a breast cancer period, and they hacked her doctor. They also hacked another singer who was pregnant, and she was just somewhere between 6 weeks and 8 weeks pregnant. And they rang her up and said, we propose to run the story in the morning that you are pregnant. And they had got this from hacking her and her doctor. And she was on tour and has now been denied the ability to say to her parents face-to-face, particularly her mother, which is what she wanted to do, that she was pregnant with her first child. Now, it's a sort of deeply human desire and wish, but it is grossly intrusive and highly inappropriate behavior. And I think that is, those are areas of enormous concern to me that, people have been intruded upon. I have 2 other clients, both of whom had their children killed, one by a paedophile, one by a maniac with a hammer. And again, these are incredibly sensational crimes. They were national news for many months in the UK, but actually you would expect their phones and their private lives at least to be sacrosanct to that degree.
I think that'll help us segue in just a moment into the whole wonderful world of Julian Assange. But before we do, I wanted to just pick up on one other thing, because the example you just gave reminds me, and I don't know if it was the same case, but of a complaint that was brought to the Press Complaints Commission about the revelation of a celebrity's pregnancy. And I don't know if that was your case or it was just a similar case. And I had actually been teaching a class in England, and we all went to the Press Complaints Commission, and they were talking about this. And I guess one of the things that's a little, again, counterintuitive for an American audience is the fact that Britain has had first the British Press Council, then the Press Complaints Commission, where people could bring complaints about ethical lapses on the part of the print media, at least, And yet they seem to have been ineffectual in stopping all of these things. Can you explain how that works and why it didn't work?
Well, I think you have to understand what the Press Complaints Commission is. It's basically the fox guarding the chickens. It's funded by the media, really as a protection racket for the media. They are a lapdog, not a watchdog. They have no sanctions ability. The only thing they can do is publish a result which says, yes, we find that there was a lapse of the conduct of the newspaper on this particular instance, and therefore you mustn't do it again, which of course they do the next week. And that, I think, is a real problem. It didn't have the confidence of the public, doesn't have the public's confidence. And if you look at the way in which the Press Council has outcomes, most regulatory bodies have a sort of a third rule. So you'd expect to see a third of complaints are found in favor of the complainant, another third would be found for the news organizations, and a further third would probably fall outside remit. Now that's standard across advertising, broadcast, all of the other media kind of areas. The problem with the Press Complaints Commission is that they would find in favor of that first group not 33%, but 3%. That's an astonishingly small, low number. And it's just, I think, not taken account of by any normal or rational reason. So it's just a body which doesn't work effectively. It was free, so it was poor man's justice, but also I would say it was no man's justice.
Do you foresee, you referenced the various investigations that are going forward, and one of them includes a committee chaired by, is it Judge Leveson?
Yeah.
That is going to be looking into the whole issue of ethics among the British press. And I've been reading among news outlets like The Guardian, for example, which was one of the newspapers that really broke the story on phone hacking, concerns that this is going to lead to legislation and regulations that are really going to stifle the ability of the press in Britain to do their jobs. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredibly poignant concern. I have been very worried about many from the media, particularly media commentators, as we would say in the UK, blowing smoke in George Leveson's general direction. You've got a judge who knows just about zero about the media. He's surrounded himself with a panel of experts to assist him. The problem is that not any one of those experts works or has worked in the tabloid media, and therefore they don't really know what goes on in the tabloid newsroom. And I have real concerns that he will make recommendations which the government will feel compelled to turn into legislation, which will inhibit proper, thorough investigative journalism. And I think that's going to be a real issue for us going forward in the UK.
Well, let's talk a little bit about investigative journalism, or at least a version of it, talking about Wikileaks, the phenomenon of Wikileaks and Julian Assange. Perhaps we could start with a little bit of background. How did you first meet Julian Assange, and how did he come to retain you?
One of my hobbies is debating. And,
we never would have guessed that.
I was debating with Julian and a couple of other people at a club in London. And he was, at that point in time, in Sweden, and he was coming in by Skype on video screen, and the rest of us were in London. And what I think we found was that there were areas within the debate that we agreed and some that we disagreed, particularly because I have a fairly strong First Amendment affinity. And I think many English people find that very alien. And as a result of that, I think I had thought about many of the issues which he has to confront on a daily basis. And whilst we didn't agree on everything, it was an informed and informative debate, I think, on both parts. And some couple of weeks later, he came to London, and one Sunday he rang me up and said, Mark, I've got a bit of a problem. I wonder if you could pop round. So I said, sure. What's the problem?
And what was the problem?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we're putting kind of the cart before the horse here. I think most of the audience would be familiar, but could you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that WikiLeaks does, and why it's become such a controversial thing?
Well, I think that one of the things that's really interesting is that, Julian Assange had a flash of genius, and the flash of genius he had was this. He identified that if you go back in time to any newspaper here in Minneapolis or indeed anywhere in the world, they've got a brown paper envelope drop box where you can take an anonymous piece of information, drop it through the letterbox, and the newspaper can deal with it. It's kind of whistleblower's approach. And what Julian did was realize that no longer do journalists get information, perhaps investigative journalists, a couple of dog-eared photocopies. What they get is data, and they get it in CDs full of information or through emails or whatever. And he felt that there were a couple of things that were important. One, it had to be anonymous, so he had to devise a system where you could deliver something to a news outlet, or in his case, WikiLeaks, where the people at WikiLeaks couldn't know who it was that had sent the email. So the whole point about WikiLeaks is that you can send data to them, and the information as to who sent that data and where it came from is stripped off so that it cannot be found and it cannot be reverse engineered. And that was, if you like, the genius of this, because it allowed people from around the world, particularly from totalitarian regimes, and also people who were in businesses which were corrupt, to effectively provide information. And to begin with, this information was provided unmediated, a bit like a pipe. You feed it in there, your email is stripped off, and out it comes onto the WikiLeaks website at the other end. And that was how it worked for a while, and then gradually they realized they needed to be slightly more sophisticated about how they dealt with this information. And so they began, I think, dealing with it in much the same way as journalists do. So they verified the information, they got comment on it, and they started to look at the data and on occasion manipulate the data to enable it to be crowdsourced and accessible. And so as a result of that, you have a sort of journalistic function, I would say, going on. Certainly there's an editorial function, and certainly there's a publishing function going on. And as a result of that, I think we've got a very interesting situation where a lot of the data that they get through is highly pertinent, highly relevant.
Can you, you're not Julian Assange, obviously, but can you articulate
Thankfully.
what the core mission is, or the beau ideal behind all this? What's driving all of this?
I think it's a belief that you should receive all shades and colors of opinion and information in order to make up, or to be able to make up your mind on issues of moment of the day. So he is prepared to provide you all the information so you can make up your mind. And that's a very different model and threatening model for people who are in traditional media. And it's a very different model which I think has arrived. It's clearly going to stay. A number of people have sought to replicate the WikiLeaks model. We've seen it with Al Jazeera. We've seen it with the Wall Street Journal. The Guardian have got their own site. There's this guy who used to work for Julian called Dom Scheitberg, who's got this thing called OpenLeaks. And more specifically, we're seeing sort of whistleblow sites set up in the UK on a wiki principle, which have, for example, pilots can supply information anonymously, educationalists, so there's one specialist for them, there's one for the National Health Service, so medical issues, and there's a kind of health and safety one. And I'm sure that they will proliferate over the years. Clearly, WikiLeaks has first mover advantage, though.
I've heard it said from some people that Julian Assange believes there should simply be no secrets at all. Is that a fair statement? No,
I think that's taking it too far. I think his his views have moderated. I think, you know, I mean, you've seen, I think, a development and evolution of WikiLeaks and of Julian and everything else. But I think it's fair to say that even from the beginning of, if you like, Cablegate, he was in touch with the ambassador, Louis Sussman, in London about what could and should responsibly be published. And I think that will astonish most people because it's not the popular belief about Julian. But he understands that, you know, there's no real desire here to get people killed. And we have a very interesting body, which I'm quite critical of, but it does set some quite useful standards. It's called the Defense Advisory Board, and it's basically a group of senior military folk headed up by a rear admiral and senior journalists who sit together, and when something comes up, the journalists get something which is classified, they sit down and determine whether it's something which shouldn't be published, if it would be it would be dangerous to publish it. So they won't publish stuff about ongoing security operations. They won't publish information where somebody might die as a result of it. And so that's the sort of issues. And that was the kind of guiding principles that went with the publication of the cables, and that's why the New York Times was in close cooperation, I think rightly so, with the Pentagon and the Guardian, with the security services in the UK. And I think as a result of that, the security services knew what was coming. They had obviously understood what the entire trove of cables contained anyway. So that was quite an interesting process, I think, and it actually meant that there was a lot of information that came out usefully. And there was only one cable which was published over the objections of the Pentagon. And that was a cable which revealed the fact, or a series of cables which revealed the fact that the Yemeni government had outsourced the bombing of its own people to the US Air Force. And the Pentagon said they didn't want this published. Clearly it's highly embarrassing, but they feared worse than that it may actually cause a war, and that would be a bigger problem. And that caused real anxious consideration in all of the newsrooms of the media partners, traditional media partners, New York Times, Guardian, Der Spiegel, Le Monde, El País, all of them, and also at WikiLeaks. And they decided in the end, on balance, to publish. And of course, if you do this, if you're going to publish in that situation, you've got to be really sure that you're publishing in the public interest and that nobody is going to die, and it's a really important story. And the reason that they decided to publish, and I think it was right that they did, but the reason they chose to publish was this. They said, look, you've got the United States military engaged in military action in the Middle East. It has not been sanctioned or approved of on the Hill. It's not been sanctioned or approved of by the United Nations. It doesn't appear to be legal in international law, and the public in the United States particularly, but around the rest of the world, doesn't know that it's going on. And therefore it's absolutely vital as a matter of public interest that people do know about that. And it was published, and luckily there was no war, but I think it was an important issue to come out.
You made reference to the whole D-notice system, which is really, we don't have anything comparable to that in a formal way here in the United States. You and I were both at a media law conference in London a couple of weeks ago, and the editor of The Guardian was there and was talking about the difference between the way a British journalist would approach national security information and the way an American journalist might approach it, and alluding to the fact that, as I'm sure most of you know, we have a strong series of cases from the U.S. Supreme Court that makes it virtually impossible for the federal government to stop journalists from publishing things. Whether there can be some kind of sanction after the fact is still somewhat of an open question. But after Pentagon Papers, it's pretty clear that it's going to be almost impossible for the government to stop publication. And so Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, was saying, you know, it's great for you in the United States to go and have your conversations with people in the Pentagon because you rest secure in the knowledge that they're not really going to be able to stop you if you decide to override them. But that's really not true for us in Britain. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, there is this tension where, you know, the New York Times had the ability to publish things which The Guardian might have been injuncted in the UK. And actually it meant that it was absolutely vital that there was this transatlantic partnership in publication, because it meant that if the New York Times was going to publish it and it couldn't be the subject of prior restraint, any prior restraint in the UK on the same story was redundant and superfluous. And as a result of that, it enabled the publication of things which otherwise might have been subject to an injunction. Alan Rusbridger was approached by the Defense Advisory Notice. The Rear Admiral called him up and said, you know, do you need our advice on what to publish or not, which is a sort of polite British way of saying, you know, why haven't you called me? He said, the reason I've not called you is I don't think we're breaching any of the Defense Advisory Notices. And so that meant, and what he was saying to them is, we aren't going to put any lives in danger. We are not going to do anything which is going to cause a problem here. And that was accepted by the people at the Ministry of Defense and the security services, and nobody ever tried to get an injunction in relation to it. And I think if you think about what's come out, a lot of this was pretty low-grade intelligence, in inverted commas, or low-grade secrets. They weren't high levels of secrecy. It was quite interesting. A guy, I mean, I've had visits from a number of security services, as you'd imagine. I'm on first name terms with some of them. And the thing that's quite interesting about that is that the guy from MI6 who came to see me right at the beginning, who wanted to know...
And MI6 is what?
MI6 is... it's the external security services, who James Bond works for. It's Judi Dench is the head, you know, it's that kind of thing. So I got a fairly high-grade individual who had been to some very rough places in the world, like Afghanistan and Iran, Iraq, and Israel, Palestine. And so it was just, you know, he came in and he wanted to know that this material was going to be treated in a reasonably responsible way. And when he had satisfied himself that that was going to be the approach that was being taken, he turned around to me as he'd finished his cup of tea and was leaving, and he said, well, of course, the Americans are the authors of their own misfortune. And I went, hey, hang on a second. That's a rather odd thing for a guy from your department to be saying. What's that all about? And he said, well, the situation is that every intelligence service on the planet limits the number of copies that you can make of a cable to 3,000. And he said the reason for that is that we all know that statistically at 3,000 we are penetrated by two major states at least, so say Russia and China, and probably a few others. And as a result, when you're disseminating information that broadly, we put a bit of disinformation in too. You'd hope we would, because that puts the other side on their mettle and makes sure that they're checking up carefully and all of those things. And he said the Americans had copied this to 3.5 million people. And he said statistically at that point, the only people who didn't know were the electorate. And interestingly, I bumped into P.J. Crowley, the former State Department spokesman, a few weeks ago in New York, and he said to me that the Americans are now back on the universal international standard of 3,000. And I think that that was probably sensible and clever. But it's, you know, you can take it a stage further. I met a former ambassador, US ambassador to Afghanistan. He said to me, look, you have to understand it's about the state keeping its secrets. I wrote, he said, in the most secure form possible, a communication to go to Washington. And he said, the way we do that is that I write it down on a piece of paper, I fold up that piece of paper and I seal it, and it's put in a bag and a pouch, and a courier takes it from my desk to the desk in Washington, where the guy in a room on his own opens it and reads it. And he said, the one message that I sent like that, supposedly the most secure method possibly, ended up on the front page of the New York Times. So, you know, there is an issue about what happens when information comes out. And I think that there has been a development, I think it's a recognition that people have been trading classified information in Washington. I mean, just to sort of neutralize this for a moment, if you are the investigative reporter or one of the top investigative reporters of the Washington Post, you trade information which is classified. You get information from people who are not supposed to be giving it to you. That is the oil that greases the wheels of diplomacy and information flows in Washington. It is what you are paid to do. And this is just moving it on to the new level, on the cyber level, I think.
Which I guess brings me to the question that I've heard many times, and I'm sure you have too, which is, you talked a lot about responsible journalism and the responsible journalist who's going to be careful not to cause deaths or not to cause serious harm. But there are those who would say, who elected those journalists to make those determinations? They are accountable to no one. They're not accountable to the electorate. They're not political appointees even. So who the heck are they to be making these unilateral decisions, overriding the decisions made by governmental officials who presumably have a lot better sense of what the ramifications of these releases would be?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard politicians rant like that.
It's not my view, of course, you realize. I'm just
in a fairly
it
uninformed way. I mean, I think you just have to go back to what we've just said. I mean, the reality is that this was done not hand in glove because there was no ceding of editorial control here, but there was a proper, responsible dialogue that went on between the state. And I said, I've given you the example of the only instance I know where this was published in the teeth of an objection, and the reason why that was. And so I think if you know what the objections are, you're in a position to perhaps respond and to address them more fruitfully. But I think let's go back to the sort of basis of this. Everybody in this room believes that the government should have secrets. We all cede a degree of secrecy to the government to enable them to better rule us in our interests. That covenant that we have with them, that we allow them secrets so that they can better rule in our interests, is something which is universal. Now, some governments abuse that, some don't. But I think what we have to say is that governments are increasingly using those secrets or over-classifying information to a degree which is unfortunate and unhelpful. We're getting to a point where information flows and freedom of information requests could easily have had much of the information which was available on the Cablegate material. And I would give you as the example that I think is, you know, the fact that China has agreed to basically cede North Korea back to the South, provided military equipment is not put into the territory which is currently North Korea, explains that, you know, why there has been no reaction by the South Koreans or indeed her allies here and more broadly to the sinking by a North Korean submarine of a military ship from South Korea, when the North Koreans open up salvos of gunfire onto South Korean islands. Why is it that there was no reaction? Well, the answer to that is that we know that this is just the death throes of the Kim Jong-il regime, and that when he's gone, actually this problem, a much larger problem in the global scheme of things, is actually going away. Now, that's a piece of information which was pretty important for us to know in terms of world geopolitics. It seems to me important, but it doesn't seem to me that we lose anything by knowing. And I just take it, the former head of MI5, that's the Internal Security Services, not the James Bond, Judi Dench bit. He said at Cambridge University about 6-8 weeks ago, he said, governments don't need that many secrets. They need some, but not as many as you would think. And I would respectfully concur with that. I think he's right. I would also say they don't need them for as long as you would think. So, and I would give you as an example of that. In April this year, it was the 50th anniversary of the invasion at the Bay of Pigs. The NSA, the National Security Agency, official history of the invasion is still not declassified. Now, why on earth? I mean, if you were 20 and you were a soldier going in, you'd be 70 today. The world has moved on in so many different ways. I mean, Castro is almost dead. It cannot be that there is anything in there which is genuinely of necessity to remain a secrecy. And here we are, sitting in a university, a seat of learning, and it seems to me that the greater that we're getting into, or the greater amount of classification, this knee-jerk approach to classification, means that social historians, political historians, particularly in relation to contemporary politics and diplomacy and such like, are unable to write their theses, their doctoral theses and their master's papers using proper, genuine, raw material from which they can make safe and genuine extrapolations and information. They're getting partial and partisan information. That is detrimental to the education process that we have in this country and around the world. I think that is a matter of enormous concern to me. And it's a broader concern which, in fact, the judiciary in the UK are concerned about, because in the UK they keep giving privacy injunctions out, and the Chief Justice of the United Kingdom, or England and Wales, the wonderfully named Judge Igor Judge, said to me that, he was concerned that these injunctions were without limit, so that once something had been said by a judge couldn't be published, it could never be published. These injunctions don't expire. And that, I think, again, has implications for our social history, which we haven't yet fully comprehended.
It's really the paradox, isn't it, that at the time of greater ability to disseminate information, judges are desperately trying to keep the lid on. I mean, is this a losing battle, not just for judges, but for dictatorships and other autocratic nations around the world that are trying desperately to maintain a status quo that doesn't exist now and can't exist in the future?
Well, I think it is. I mean, we've had, many of you will have heard about the super injunctions we've had in the UK. And basically, they are an injunction that you go to court and somebody says, a newspaper is trying to publish something about my private life, usually an affair. The judge says, well, in that case, I'll grant an injunction, a prior restraint injunction, which says they may not publish it. But guess what, folks? I'll add a second injunction to that, a bonus, a twofer, and I'll give you a second injunction which says the newspaper can't even report the fact that there is an injunction in place in the first place, and they can't name you. So it's a kind of a whole bond of secrecy. And so what happens is, and certainly what's happened in the UK, is that this has burst out into social media, and people began to tweet, who had got the latest super injunctions. And there were, people who would go around. And I noticed one particular site, which I had an interest in because it had wrongly named one of my clients as being a person who got a super injunction. And I saw it late one Saturday night, and it had 1,400 followers. By the next evening, it had over 50,000. By the end of the week, it had over 500,000. And this site was tweeting the names of people who got super injunctions. So, you know, people had got an injunction in London, which is kind of like the libel and privacy capital of the world now. People jet in from all over the world to get their injunctions. And which, I mean, you know, as lawyers in London, we're not terribly disappointed about. We have children to educate too. But there is an issue, there's a serious issue here, which was that what happened was we found ourselves in a situation where, you know, these sexually incontinent celebrities and footballers and soccer players and whatever were going around getting injunctions. And, you know, there's one guy who plays for Manchester United who had slept, married, he had slept with a model and a television presenter. He'd also slept with his sister-in-law, which I thought was a height of bad taste. And he got an injunction to prevent his wife knowing about it. And, you know, his name became, you know, he became the poster child for this. So Ryan Giggs' name is posted all over over Twitter feeds. And, you know, because the injunction is obtained in London, it doesn't have any impact on Twitter, based in Folsom Street in San Francisco. So, of course, they carry on publishing away the name. And, you know, the same has happened with other actors and actresses. And I have to say that I have real concerns about these injunctions in any case. So another soccer player who used to be an England player, he had unprotected sex with an Algerian prostitute. Now, it seems to me that his girlfriend of the time, long-time girlfriend who was pregnant, had a right to know. If he was putting in jeopardy her sexual health, it seems to me she had a right to know. And the court, by giving this injunction, I believe, behaved amorally in giving him a monopoly on this information so that she would never know. And I just think that that is inappropriate. Whether or not you believe this should be plastered across the tabloid media, it seems to me that there is an absolute right that she should have been told by the court before they granted the wider injunction.
Which brings me to the last question I'm going to ask you, which is, so is privacy dead? You were talking about Twitter and other forms of social media where people are voluntarily sharing vast quantities of information about themselves. You've got data miners that are out there harvesting personally identifiable information about people, sometimes without their knowledge, but sometimes with their consent. So is all of this talk about injunctions and secrecy and even Wikileaks a quaint discussion that we wouldn't be having 5 years from now because the whole concept of privacy would have died?
I think the whole concept of privacy has really changed. I think that we have sold the pass to our private lives, and I think virtually everything is now discoverable and or available online or in some other way. And I think that that is something that we have to understand, that there is a greater degree of exposure, a greater degree of scrutiny. And the concept, which is really interesting, that the French developed many years ago, the right to be forgotten, is now being enacted in European Union law. So that will be right across all the countries of the European Union, including the UK. And the idea is that you may have done something which was noteworthy and publicity and got you national publicity, but after a period of time, the collective memory forgets, and as a result, you should be entitled to have that collective memory forget permanently. And this is a piece of legislation which is coming through, and I think it's quite interesting because that again is going to, it's an attempt to put the toothpaste back in the tube. I think it fails because as soon as you've got archives, information is out there, and I think that's going to be the problem for the future, the real challenge.
Now we'd like to invite you to join our conversation. And as I said, we have two people. We have Holly and Emily who have their microphones in hand. So if you would raise your hand, they will bring a microphone to you. And again, we ask that you keep your question to a question and not a speech. But Mark will answer as many questions as we can take time to do. So, questions? Don't be shy, Minnesotans.
Good evening. In the past few months, several institutions as well as individuals have filed suit in the D.C. Circuit asking the CIA and the Department of Justice for access to images and videos of Osama bin Laden after he was killed in Pakistan, as provided by the Freedom of Information Act. So my question is, not only do you think, is that information eventually going to be leaked, maybe not by a highbrow institution like the New York Times or the Washington Post, but by davesblog.com, who eventually releases that information? And do you feel as though that there is now an inegalitarian difference between institutions that can be held accountable, like the Washington Post, as opposed to social networks such as Twitter or Tumblr or Facebook or what have you?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking it. I think that one of the problems or one of the challenges that has been eventuated by WikiLeaks and its phenomena has been that the establishment has recognized that you can't really do something about information once it's in the hands of the media, whether that's WikiLeaks or the New York Times or Washington Post. What you can do is nail the leaker. And I think it has become clear to me that people like President Obama downwards have made it clear that unauthorized leaks of information will be criminally dealt with. And this is going to have a chilling effect on the free flow of information to the public, because it means that only the spin doctors will have the control of information, and that's an unfortunate state of affairs. So I think, will pictures of Osama bin Laden's body come out? No, I don't think they will. I think they are going to be locked away. Gone are the days of Che Guevara's body being pictured. I think in terms of social media, I think that it's more likely to come out through something like WikiLeaks. I think social media isn't going to produce that. It's not, I don't quite know how they're going to get to control it, because the information's got to get to them before it comes out. So I think there are going to be some issues around that. But I think that this attack on sources is going to have a chilling effect on the flow of information to legitimate journalists and indeed others reporting in the media. And I think that's going to be a big problem, a big challenge for journalism and journalism students going forward.
I actually want to go back to the phone hacking question a little bit. If you could kind of put yourself in the shoes, or I guess in the position of maybe having to defend, well, I guess not News of the World, because there is no more, but News International maybe more generally, sort of would it or could you justify these practices in any way? I mean, obviously, you probably would also take the approach that they have taken, which is just throw money at the problem, but if you found yourself before a judge trying to explain maybe the broader issues, or what sort of perhaps trying to stop these legislative responses that might be create problems down the road, is there any kind of justification you could kind of present more broadly?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, let's start from the position that it's criminal. It's a criminal act. It's a criminal act here. It's a criminal act there. So it's criminal. The question, it seems to me, is should there be a public interest defense? And the majority of what we were seeing come out was celebrity scuttlebutt. And in truth, nobody much cared and nobody did anything about it if we were finding out about Sienna Miller or someone like that. Where things started to go wrong for News International was when they hacked the mobile phone of a dead girl. And the issue was raised that they were erasing messages that were left by her friends And so as a result, people falsely thought she was alive. But let's just turn that on its head for a moment and present a different analysis. Let's put ourselves in a situation where the journalist had hacked into the phone and found that the girl had run away from home because one of the parents was a paedophile, and that the journalist was able to rescue and bring the girl in. Would we be in the same position we are now? Would we think that that was justifiable? Would we think it was in the public interest to prosecute that journalist? And I think that those are really profound questions, and it leaves open the question for me as to whether phone hacking is always wrong. Clearly accept it's a criminal offense, but is it always morally wrong? And I'm not sure it is. I think there are going to be occasions when there are, if you like, overriding public interests when we need to find out what's going on. And I think that there are real issues that flow from that about what journalists can do and what their conduct is going forward. And I think there needs to be some sort of check and balance. So, for example, in the UK, we have like a two-stage decision-making process if we're going to engage in deception or secret filming. And the two stages are this. If you believe or you have a really good source of information which says that there's criminality or some serious wrongdoing going on, then you have to ask yourself, can I get that information any other way to stand the story up? The answer is no. You can go to a senior editor and say, I think we should use deception/secret filming in order to gather the evidence that we believe is there. And then you gather the evidence. You may show nothing. If, however, it does show something that's wrong, then you make a second decision about whether or not to publish. And that seems to me to be a very responsible way. So it's a proportionate response. My concern out of the Judge Leveson inquiry is that that's too sophisticated for him. And I think that as a result of that, we're going to get an absolute bar. That's not particularly a criticism of him. I just think it is the people who are partaking in the inquiry are not up to dealing with the day-to-day difficulties and challenges that we're going to have. And I think if we are prevented from finding out about serious wrongdoing and criminality through the use of what I would say was legitimate investigative journalism, then I think we are all the poorer, because criminality and serious wrongdoing doesn't happen in the daylight. It happens in the shadows. And so you have to shine the spotlight into the darkest of corners.
With the bleak picture that you're painting about governments clamping down on journalists and leakers, what kind of balance is there, or check on the power of a president who can take drones and go kill people in other countries? What kind of information can we get, and what kind of control do we have anymore over our government?
Well, I think the answer is very little. And I know that this is causing profound concern to many international lawyers, as well as others who just have a day-to-day concern about it. I think that there is a real issue around how you deal with that. It's not a very popular approach, but it does seem to me that you didn't need to storm. Once you've identified where Osama bin Laden is, you don't have to storm his citadel. In the Middle Ages, they used to lay siege. What's wrong with that today?
But what about this guy in Yemen, the drone?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the guy in Yemen, which is the question, who the US citizen who was killed, and it seems to me that this is the next stage, that targeted assassinations are going to take place. The problem is that whilst they're people that are beyond the pale, nobody is really going to kick up about it. But, you know, we are not going through, we seem to have abandoned the rule of law. We're not going through due process. There is no, even if you believe in the death penalty, which I strongly don't. I mean, I was in Georgia last week for Troy Davis, But it seems to me that there was a real issue around, at least he got due process. If you're a guy in Yemen, you haven't got due process. And that does seem to me to be problematic.
Hi, I want to go back to something you said earlier, and I just would like to point out that hacking is not the only way of obtaining information illegally, and in fact, it's not a one-way process. If I solicit someone for information, say nuclear secrets, certain forms of solicitation are a crime. So I want to go back to the reference you made to the brown envelope, the anonymous source of a newspaper, for instance. And in a 2008 interview, Julian Assange said that part of WikiLeaks' mission was not only to defend the leaked information, but to get as much political impact from it as possible. And I guess my question is WikiLeaks in some way soliciting illegal information? Is it soliciting people to obtain information illegally? For instance, if a politician, doesn't it make it worth their while to, for instance, hide the corpse with WikiLeaks, where they can, they can turn in information, politically damaging information for their own gain? Is WikiLeaks soliciting people to go out and obtain information illegally?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. I mean, clearly it has a website. It receives information. I suppose it's a passive solicitation, if that's not a contradiction or oxymoron. But it seems to me that the question misses the point, if I may. And the reason I think it misses the point is this. If you are an investigative journalist working for any of the traditional media, you cultivate sources, sometimes in the security services, sometimes at diplomatic level, sometimes highly placed politicians. It doesn't really much matter, sometimes captains of industry. But you go to those sources, and they may, over a very languid and liquid lunch, give you a piece of information. They may give you some data, and you will go back to your office and you will look at it, and you may consider it, and you may say, go back to them and say, that was really interesting, but actually I'm not interested in that main thing that you've given me. I'm more interested in something off at a tangent. Or you may say, actually, I'm not interested in that at all. I'm interested in something over here. Have you got anything on that? Now, that's an active part of solicitation. But to me, that's part of policing the covenant that I was talking about. It's up to the state to keep its secrets, and it's up to the media, the third estate, to ensure that we keep them honest. And it seems to me that that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. I have no knowledge of whether Julian Assange did or did not solicit. I don't think it matters. My personal belief is he didn't. And the reason I would say that is that very early on in the piece, he once said to me, well, of course, the whole reason that I never knew the name Bradley Manning, and I don't know whether it was Bradley Manning or not, was because the way WikiLeaks is set up, the information comes in and I don't know who they are. And the purpose that I set up WikiLeaks in this way was so that someone couldn't come to a court order and say, right, we want to subpoena your computer records, or we, on pain of sending you to jail, want you to tell us who the source was. He said, it's much better if I don't know, and I genuinely don't know, to be able to say, I have no idea and have no records which will help you one way or another. And from a journalistic point of view, I think that where you've got shield laws of different intensities and different abilities to protect journalists, that was probably quite a sensible approach for him, given what he was doing.
From a legal perspective, yes, but going back to ethics just for 1 second, you talked a little bit...
I'm a lawyer.
Yeah, I know you are. So we know you have no ethics. But no, seriously, you talked a little bit about the verification or the authentication of the records. And I think that's the piece that some people would find might be missing here. If you don't know who's giving you the information, how can you be sure that it's what it purports to be?
Well, I think that that was part of what caused the change from being a mere conduit, if you like, from receiving information, stripping off the outside envelope and ending up with raw data, to actually going through it. So many people will be, in this room, I suspect, astonished that the American government were willing to confirm the authenticity of the cables, all 275,000 of them. Now, you know, they could have not commented or done nothing, but they actually said, no, they're real. And so, you know, at that point, you know that you're dealing with something which is, you know, important. And that is, you know, part of where I think you start to go down the journalistic track, and you can have arguments about how far down the journalistic track you go. But if I go back to the Pentagon Papers, when that was published in book form, originally the book that was published basically had the raw data in, with very little commentary around them. And, you know, that was held by the Supreme Court of this country to be protected. And I think rightly so.
So in examples like the Bay of Pigs, where a lot of information remains classified, besides satisfying the curiosity of the people in this room and people like us, what is the motivation and benefit of declassifying information that could potentially just rustle feathers?
Well, the comfort or otherwise of the state is not something which causes me any sleep at all. You know, let's remember, this is our data. They're doing this in our name. And provided they are within the circumference of that bond that we have with them, that tryst that we have with them, that they can have secrets and keep them for us as long as they're working in our interest, I don't have a problem. After that, I think I'm entitled to know. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and I really believe this, I mean, as you heard in the introduction, I'm the chairman of the University of East London in the UK. I chair a course at Oxford University in the UK. I work with the University of Hong Kong as well. I am really, really of the belief that social historians, people studying politics and diplomacy and all of those other social sciences and everything else where this material is relevant, it's the raw data on which they should be founding their work, their research. That is the sort of essence of material, whether comfortable or not, that provided it doesn't need to be secret, it should be available for us to work on as educationalists and as researchers. And that's part of our social history. It's part of where we are as human beings. And that seems to me to be absolutely right. And I think every university in this country and in the UK should be fighting for as much information as possible to make it available. Because if we don't have that raw data on which to work, we've got an increasingly burgeoning amount of data which is classified. If you go back even 10, 15 years, the line on classification goes like that. It's almost perpendicular now. And that has profound implications for the future, because when does the information become unclassified? Are we really saying we have to delay everything by 20 or 30 years until it becomes classified? Or in the case of the Bay of Pigs, who knows? Way past 50 years.
I mean, we have a somewhat specialized audience here, I think, because most of us come together because we believe in freedom of information and freedom of expression. But do you think the public in the UK and the United States buys into what you're saying, to the notion that we really need to have access to this information, or have they accepted the government's line?
I don't think that they really engage with the question. And, you know, most people in Middle England and Middle America, I think, you know, are quite happy not really engaging with this at all. But I think that people in seats of learning across the world really do have to engage with it, because it has profound implications for the future. And I think that we have to think about how we're going to deal with this. We are living in a changing world. It's important for us to understand the nature of that changing world, the increasing complexity in that changing world, and the interrelations and the altering webs between those different countries, so that we can actually track information flows and how one impacts on the other. And I think that that's critical to our understanding of the world about us. And I think, you know, if it's just the people in this room or people like us as we replicate across the world, those are the people who have got to start talking about this and making it an issue.
Do we have?
There are a number of people who support the idea of WikiLeaks, but argue that its irreverent attitude, and especially that of Mr. Assange, has made it very easy to vilify and consequently sort of a poster child for the need to further secure information to weaken whistleblower protections and perhaps even limit the First Amendment somewhat. So do you think this is a legitimate position? And if so, what are your thoughts on the argument?
I think that it's a really interesting question, that, because I think that Julian Assange has been vilified, there's no doubt about it, in my mind. Whether he deserves it is another question, which I can see both sides of the argument. But I think let's just roll this back a bit. Julian, when he set up WikiLeaks, understood that it was better to be a stateless organization. It was better that everybody, including him, was anonymous. And that's how it was from the beginning. And what happened was that he was identified within the hacker community, and then he was outed within the computer tech geeky community on the West Coast, and then eventually a newspaper named him as being behind WikiLeaks, but nobody really took any notice of it. But when the national newspaper named him, they had an internal discussion at WikiLeaks. What do we do about this? And they decided that, Julian is the editor-in-chief, but they decided that the best thing to do was to allow him to take the flak, if you like, but also to be the public face. That allowed all the other people who were anonymous, who work with WikiLeaks, to carry on with their lives, to have 2.4 motor cars, to have mortgages, to, carry on with their lives untrammeled. And I think it played to their advantage in this way. When there was an attempt to take Assange down in a sort of personal character assassination way, the back end of last year, and he was also when he was put in jail on the charges whilst pending bail. It was really interesting because WikiLeaks, not a lot of people understand this, and I think that the American government didn't understand it at the time. WikiLeaks is over 1,000 people around the planet, all working together as a community. And so quite interestingly, when you've got that number of people, you take one person out, it doesn't actually have impact. It's a bit like the editor, being out to lunch at hospital on holiday for a national newspaper. The newspaper still carries on, it churns information out. And Julian's assistants take great delight and pride in pointing out that to anyone who'll listen, that when he was in prison, they got more data out per day than any other time in their history, much to Julian's chagrin, I think. But, it is quite an interesting fact. And I personally try to depersonalize it because I can see that people have strong views about Julian one way or another. But in relation to WikiLeaks and what it does and the phenomena, I think we've seen a change. And we have to think about this. Is if, the information which he's provided has led to profound change in India. The coalition government there has fallen as a result of the information that he's provided about politicians living beyond their means and corruption in government there. There are countries around the world where he is, frankly, lauded because of the work he's done. Middle East, North Africa, for example, is one area where a lot of the work that went on was because people understood and were able to talk about, in, say, Tunisia, were able to talk about the cables. They realized that for the first time, they realized that the American government had the same jaundiced view that each one of them privately held about their regime, and that if they rose up, they might actually support the change to a more democratic regime. And I think that that has spread through the Arab Spring that we saw, and I think we've seen it in other countries of the world. I mean, if you go to Malawi, Congo-Brazzaville, people in those countries, Peru, they've had profound change as a result of what's come out. And that's probably been not a bad thing.
I think we have time for one more question.
I was wondering if I could get your thoughts about one particular type of justification for keeping a certain category of secrets, and it's one that I think we've seen a lot lately. We've seen it with the Osama bin Laden photos. We saw it with Congress's decision to do a statutory amendment to prevent the Abu Ghraib photographs from being released. We saw it a few years back when there was a lot of condemnation of Newsweek for publishing a story about Korans being flushed down a toilet, I think in Iraq. And that is the justification in these cases by the government for either not disclosing information or for punishing it after disclosure is this kind of thing internationally will spark such furor that it will lead to violence. And what I find sort of fascinating about that particular type of justification is it straddles two worlds. I mean, on the one hand, it straddles the type of justification which is often considered completely indefensible, the notion that, well, we don't want people to know that we've done bad things. They might be angry at us. But on the other hand, it's plausible, in some cases at least, that violence could be sparked. So I was wondering what your thoughts are, both on whether you think descriptively this is a justification we're seeing, at least from the U.S., more in favor of secrecy, and also, what you think about the merits of that kind of a claim for secrecy.
I think it's bogus, and I mean, it's kind of see no evil. It didn't happen, therefore there is no reaction. It sort of puts an end run around accountability. If a state is going to authorize an extrajudicial killing of Osama bin Laden or someone in Yemen, then it should be accountable for that, and perhaps a heightened level of accountability for that because it is extrajudicial. Now, I understand the arguments for doing it. Whether I agree or disagree with them doesn't really much matter. It's a personal issue. But we should be able to have a debate about it, and we should be able to have that discussion openly. And I kind of say to myself, well, one of the problems I've had as I've gone around the world, particularly, I mean, just take a sort of a much lesser example, is as I've gone to places around the Commonwealth where they have criminal libel and they lock journalists up for what they write and what they speak, they have said to me, oh, yeah, but Mark, you have criminal libel in the UK. And I said, but we never use it. And they said, well, you've still got it. You could use it. And it's that kind of, double standard. So I would say, what standard we would project onto a totalitarian regime or any other regime around the world, we should be able to protect us or to accept ourselves. We should be able to embrace that. It may not be comfortable at all times, but democracy isn't comfortable. It's not pretty. And that's the joy of it. That's what makes it so good.
Mark, I think that's a wonderful note on which to end this evening's conversation. May I remind everybody here that this is the 26th Silha lecture. There will be another one next year. We hope you will join us then. There are comment cards outside on the tables. We invite your comments. You can join our mailing list. And now please join me in thanking Mark Stevens.